Thanks for those who prepared food for today. We'll be a little bit like the 20s class. We'll probably have some people coming in along the way, but we appreciate those who've done that. As we move back from Australia, I told our kids, you'll sing this as a part of our state song, but there's a line that says, "The wind comes sweeping down the plain." And I'm glad we all look like we live in Oklahoma today rather than just everything being perfect. So just nothing like a good cold Oklahoma wind. I really appreciate the work that Charles has put into preparing lessons for the whole congregation, and would encourage you to look at the questions. I don't follow them necessarily week by week, but something very significant happens when we're able to kind of read together and share together and then talk about different aspects. And Lord willing, through the year, it'll be very appropriate to give some biographical lessons on some of these great people that we find, especially in the early part of Genesis. Our central idea today is God began working out his eternal plan by making a covenant with Abraham. And as we look at this, I'd like for you to notice how God's covenant with Abraham begins this unfolding of what God's going to say through Paul in Ephesians, that this plan was in the mind of God before creation. And that's why, as we said last week, we can study Joseph as a person biographically, and then we can study the nation, and everyone after Abraham are helping to fulfill the plan that God is going to establish through Abraham, even if they're conscious of it or not. And then the final thing is we need to always reflect and consider things about God. And so we're going to start with God today and his covenants. And while this will just be the first two, this is very important in terms of just kind of the whole picture of the whole Bible. I don't like to use words that we don't use a lot, so that's why I just gave a brief definition. Today, when I talk about covenants, when I say a unilateral covenant, like for example, God doesn't ask Noah to do this, 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 and this. After the flood, God just simply says, I'm going to make a covenant with you. I will never again destroy the earth by flood. I give you this promise by giving you the sign of the rainbow. And then Noah isn't expected to do A, B, and C. God makes the covenant, so it's a one-way covenant. By contrast, as we're going to see, the covenant that's made at Mount Sinai is very different in that it's a bilateral, it's a two-way covenant. God says this, and the people say, and we'll look at this in a second, all the words of this covenant we will do. And this is going to be very significant. And so there are others, but these are kind of the 5 major covenants that God makes with people. And again, coming to us, and then we'll work backwards, probably the 2 most serious covenants that we enter into are at baptism, and if we choose to get married and say, till death do us part, and these are very significant covenants. And what we're going to find out about God is that God relates to his people. God has relationship with his people through covenants. So here's the first one, and we've looked at Noah, and I just put the word unilateral, and God just simply says, I'll never again destroy the earth by flood. We were on a campaign to Scottsbluff, Nebraska, when we were working with South Walker, which became Southern Oaks, and doing a VBS. And late one afternoon, a storm kind of went past us. And so all across the eastern sky was just black, very, very dark blue and black. And for about 20 minutes, there was a perfect double rainbow. I mean, it was just sunny on our side. The sun was going down. And you just could not have seen anything more magnificent because that solid black background. And here was this affirmation to us about God's covenant. Yes, someday the earth is going to be kindling. It will be destroyed by fire. But God promises Noah, I will never again destroy the earth by flood. And that's the first covenant. The covenant we're going to see with Abraham is very significant too, because, and I'm going to talk about it primarily in terms of a son, which will become a family and descendants, a land, I will give you this land, and through you I will bless all nations. And what I'm going to suggest is that the last part of that is still being fulfilled today. And we'll come to that and look at that later. Let's go ahead and look at David and Christ, and then we'll come back to Moses just to kind of introduce these. As David has established himself as king, he has been wanting to build a house for God, and there's a play on words, there's a pun here in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And so David is interested in building a physical house, a temple, but God says, because you've shed so much blood, you will not build a house for me, but I will make of you a house. And I want you to think about this in terms of our New Testament. Who is the first and the last person that we meet in the New Testament? This is the beginning of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, and Matthew knows his genealogy, but the very first thing he says is he's the son of David, the son of Abraham. Who is the last human being we meet in the book of Revelation? You look, it's going to be David. And David is a very significant person because God is going to fulfill the covenant both through Abraham, but as God builds a house, then Jesus is also the son of David. Beggars see him come in and say, "Son of David, have mercy on us." And so again, here's God working through people and through events to bring about his purposes, even when and most often they're not even aware about it. Our covenant with Christ, I also state as unilateral, and I'll explain this in just a second, but the significance of the covenant is not you and I, it's Christ. And notice these verses, and this comes both from Jeremiah 31, and then will be repeated in Hebrews 8. And this is one of the longest quotations that is given in this context. But God says, "The days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, not like the covenant I made with their fathers." And you look at the old covenant, there was circumcision on the 8th day. A young person comes into the covenant, and as he grows up, they'll keep saying, "Know the Lord, know the Lord." And the little Jewish boy would kind of say, "Why?" And they'll say, "Well, even on your physical body is the sign of the covenant because of circumcision." But they're brought into the covenant before they're able to, on the 8th day. They'll no longer do this because they'll no longer say, "Know the Lord," because they will all know me from the least of them to the greatest. We can't get into the new covenant without faith, without knowing Christ. And this is one of many things that's different about the new covenant. I just chose two samples. Hebrews 7 says, the covenant is based on the power of an indestructible life. And just let that sink in. Jesus Christ, the indestructible life. Every one of us, the outer man is doing what? Decaying. And the inner man is being what? Renewed day by day. In 2013, I did 35 funerals. And the first 12 days of 2014, I did 4. So I did nearly 40 funerals in a year. Granville will know what I'm trying to say. Can I say, do you know what it's like to leave the lights on the car overnight and the battery kind of goes vroom, vroom. So I'm doing 2 sermons a week, 3 lessons, normally doing home Bible studies, and then we add 40 funerals on top of that for a year. It's a very sobering experience. But isn't it a world of difference, Granville, doing a funeral for a non-Christian family and for people of faith? And we're convinced that these people are going to come out of the grave. But the covenant's not based on us and our humanity and our frailty. It's based on the power of an indestructible life. Jesus Christ raised from the dead, never to die again. And then I love this verse also about Jesus. He is the guarantee of the better covenant. We're not the guarantee, he is. And then when you look at the contrast then, and it's going to be in Exodus 24 and verse 8, the people are at the foot of Mount Sinai, and just visually, I'd just love to see what this is. They've talked about the terms of the covenant. They're going to say all these things we're going to do. And literally, Moses takes basins of blood and he hurls the blood on the people. I don't know, what word would you use? Sobering, shocking, and I'm sure the people closest got more blood on them than the others, but literally, blood was thrown upon the people, and they say all the words of this covenant we will do, and guess what? Over and over and over and over and again, they break the covenant. And we find God is going to be faithful to his covenant even when man is faithless. And so today, what we're going to notice as this unfolding of God's plan takes place is that we're going to be introduced to Abram, and this is going to be something that God's going to do a number of times. And Abram, if you'll notice, here's number one. God is going to speak to, and originally Abram means the father of height. And then when we come to Abraham, his name's going to be changed. Then his name is going to be the father of a multitude. Okay? So initially, let me get my directions right. Okay, I'm going to start over here. We're going to think about Abram on this side, and then I'll cross the aisle on the other side and start talking about Abraham here in a second. And notice there's a really important contrast, because you think, how many times did God or Jesus change someone's name? Of the three patriarchs, the rascal in the group is Jacob, and Brother McCord used to call him heel grabber. Somebody who trips someone up, who kind of will tell you half the truth. We have a couple of guys in our congregation who are Christian car salesmen, but we know the stereotype of the used car salesman will tell you anything to sell a car. That's going to be Jacob. And so God's going to say, after he wrestles with him, oh, you now will be called what? Israel. And after you start making covenants, when you find El in a Hebrew name, it will have something to do with God. And you get to thinking Daniel, Ezekiel, Israel, and all these names will have something to do with God. But in the case of Abraham, he's going to go from Abram, the father of heights, and he will then become known eventually as the father of the multitude. So when you look at this covenant, and if you had the outline and you looked at it, it's really good for us to kind of notice these things. I'm going to break them down into 3. Some people will do 4. I've read other Hebrew students who do as many as 7 items in the promise, but we're going to notice at least 3 today. The first one is, I'm going to give you this land. And what's very significant about this is that as we read through the Old Testament, God did that. The land was given to them. And I occasionally listen or talk with people who are still waiting for God to fulfill the promise. He did that. And especially from the time of David, the boundaries are going to be established of that. Secondly, I'm going to make of you a great nation. And if I do a lesson on Abraham, this is one of my favorite verses in that whole section. God takes him out at night and says, Abraham, let's count the stars. When I was in Boy Scout, we had a scout leader. He worked for the gas company in town. But Carol Diltz had taken the scouts to the planetarium often enough that he could do the planetarium show live. And so they put either tarp or blankets down on top of a hillside on a very dark night, and he had a flashlight with this many batteries, and he would do the planetarium presentation live out here under the Oklahoma sky. And so you think about this being a little guy, and you lay there and you just look up at all these stars, and it's just an amazing thing. But one of the things I always notice, and this is just a part of life experience, is that as soon as we cross the equator and we go on the other side, the primary constellation instead of the Big Dipper is going to be what? The Southern Cross. When you look at the geography, I don't know that Abraham ever saw the Southern Cross. He did see part of the stars of the sky, but like many of God's promises, he never saw the fullness of it. and people who live in the southern hemisphere would count a whole different group of stars than Abraham did. And God says, count the stars, and if you can count the stars, you can count your children. And the amazing thing is, we're headed toward 100 with no children. But God keeps saying, count the stars. Then the third one is going to be, through you and by you, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. And this is something that is still going on today. We had a young lady baptized at Macquarie in Sydney, and she was German. And we had a welcome circle after, and John Gray said, tonight, Germany has contributed to the promises of God, and that through you, all nations will be blessed. And another person from another nation has been added to the promise of Abraham. And so every time we support someone and they baptize someone from another nation, God's promise to Abraham is still being fulfilled. And if you were here last week, Abraham is about how many years before the cross? About 2,000. We're going to be about 2,000 years later. And so 4,000 years, God's still fulfilling this promise. And I oftentimes think about this when someone's baptized. We're doing something very specific, very personal, laying hands on a person, immersing them in water, but we're still fulfilling this promise that God made to and through Abraham. So when you look at number 2, we won't read these, but I encourage you to look at these. Over and over, God repeats different aspects of this promise. And there's an Old Testament student named Walter Kaiser, and these vary an awful lot, but he thinks the single organizing factor of the whole Old Testament is God's promises. God will make promise after promise after promise, and you just wait a few hundred years and it will be fulfilled. It might not happen overnight, but if God promises, it's going to be fulfilled, and you can see a whole group of these. So what I want to do on number 3, and it will go down, is that we'll look at just some highlights of the life, first of all, of Abram. And what's going to be important is that on the far right-hand side of your sheet are going to be dates. Now, this is a volunteer. Some of you may choose not to participate. But if you're 75 or older, would you hold your hand up? Okay. We may have well, I won't say that. Start saying we might be as honest on that as reading the Bible, but let's not go there. What I want you to notice is that the greatest challenges to faith with Abraham intensified from 75 on. And friends, what's so important is, and this has happened a couple of times, I've been with, and they happen to be 2 ladies who were in their 80s, and they were nearly home and they gave up. And you just leave, and you just you're nearly there. Just keep persevering. And what we're going to find is that some of the greatest challenges to Abraham's faith, well, let me come back and say it a different way. I differed with this growing up, but I do more so now. I used to go to youth rallies, and somebody would say, the greatest challenges you have are as a teenager. I don't doubt that there's a lot of challenges as a teenager, but you try to convince a young mother with 3 or 4 children that her greatest challenges were when she was a teenager and was just looking after herself. And then you let her get a little bit older, and she's looking after a teenager and 2 aged parents or grandparents, and try to convince her that the greatest challenges were when she was a teenager. And then, as she gets older, how long can she live in her house? Little children, little problems. Big children, big problems. And so it goes all the way through. But notice, this man of faith is going to demonstrate aspects of his faith after 75 in a way that's even more intense than he did when he was younger. We are to walk by faith and not by sight all of our lives, all the way through the end. So notice, I'm under number 3, under Roman numeral 1. Here are several datable events. Abram, the father of height, and here's what's going to be significant. All the events in Genesis 12 through 17 are going to take place before he's circumcised. They are going to take place while his name is Abram, before it's Abraham. And technically, okay, being a little pedantic, a little picky here, technically he's a Gentile. in that what is the sign of the Jewish covenant? Circumcision. He's not going to be circumcised until he's 99. And so the reason why I put all of these things together is that this man of faith, as we're going to see in a bit, is going to be the father of us all, whether we're Jew or Gentile. And there's not a Jew alive who wouldn't claim Abraham as a spiritual descendant. But what's very significant is that all of these events, while he is Abram, take place before he's circumcised, take place before he is Abraham. And technically, if you were a Gentile in the early church, you can say, this is my spiritual forefather of faith, because look at all the things he did by faith before he became a Jew. Everybody see where we're going on that? And that's very significant in terms of being inclusive as a part of the covenant. So here's number one. He and his family were once idolaters. And let this sink in for a second. He and his family were once idolaters. And when you come to Joshua's farewell, and he's going to be wrapping things up and encouraging the people, even as Moses did at the end of Deuteronomy, he is going to say they lived beyond the flood and they worshiped other gods. I misplaced the book this week, and we may still do this next week. But if I use the expression Fertile Crescent, if you go from the bottom of Euphrates, Ur of the Chaldees, he and Terah are going to go up to Haran for a number of years. They're going to come down into Canaan. For a period of time, they go into Egypt. And Abraham is going to traverse and travel throughout the entire places of civilization of his age, as we call it the Fertile Crescent. But, and I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder, as he grows to be the person of faith we know him to be, he has feet of clay. He makes terrible mistakes. But I also wonder if it would be easier to learn to depend on God if you weren't living with your original family surrounded by idolatry, at least the family gods that they had known. And so this is very significant. Abraham, Terah, the early patriarchs originally are polytheistic. They worship many gods. They're idolaters. So God comes to an idolater and says, I want you to leave this land and go to a place that I will show you. So here's number two. He accompanied Terah to Haran. They lived there for a while, as God has asked them to do. And it's going to be, and this is the upper part, probably upper part of Syria today. And then from there, God is going to call him to come down and to live in the land of Canaan. And that's number three. Have you ever been tempted to tell half the truth? She's my sister. Well, sort of. And here's something that's just an entire lesson within itself. God is going to keep working with these very frail, I like to use the expression, feet of clay people. And rather than trusting in God, he wants her to say, she's my sister, to protect them while they're in Egypt. Number five, he's going to separate from Lot. That's an entire story again. And then in chapter 15, God's going to receive or renew the promise again, another promise of the heir. And what I want you to notice on the right-hand side is that he's 75 years old when they go into Canaan. So this starts the countdown headed toward 99. And number six, this to me is really, really essential from this point of view. Before he's circumcised, he trusts, he believes in God, and it is credited to him as righteousness. And as we're going to see later, this is one of the keynotes, especially of Paul, Hebrew writer will say this as well, is that Christians are to be people who are made right with God through their faith, and because of their faith, it's credited to them as righteousness, and here's Abraham doing this. Number seven, he listens to Sarah, and Ishmael is born, and we'll come to his name here in a second. But notice he's 85 years old. Everett Hubbard has taught leadership at Harding in Memphis for a long time. And he says every time individuals and a church start helping God little Ishmaels start running around. Just think about it a little bit. Every time as individuals and as churches, we start helping God rather than trusting in God, then little Ishmaels will start running around. And I'm sure none of you have ever done that, so we can just go right on, okay? So, number 8, he is commanded to be circumcised. And here's what I want you to notice, he's 99 years old. For a number of years, I did a devotional in a nursing home. Wonderful, wonderful people. And as my Australian friend says, he often comes through the back door. We were just talking one day. And in this nursing home, I said, now the last baby shower we had here, was it blue or pink? And they finally got it and just started laughing. I said, well, what? Now, when was the last baby shower we had here in this nursing home? Here's what I want you to notice. As the promise of having the child comes on, Abraham is 99 and she is 89. When's the last time you've heard of an 89-year-old woman bearing a child? And so all of these things are going to happen while he is Abram and while this is being made. And I'll just go ahead and tell you, I'll be glad to come visit you in the hospital, but if we get to talking about too many medical details, I'll just quietly dismiss myself so they don't carry me out. We're with a friend. He says, yeah, when they took the baby, they lasered her open and they stapled her together. And I'm saying, stop, stop, stop. Either let me out or change the subject. Don't want any more details. I just cannot conceive of being circumcised at 99 without just knocking you out for 3 or 4 days with medication. I mean, I just can't hardly go there. And when you look at these acts of faith that they're called to do, I mean, you just think about this. Being 99 years old in a pre-medical situation that we have and undergoing circumcision. But this becomes the sign of the covenant. This is also a part of the transition. This is a part of the change. And so he's 99 years old. He becomes circumcised. So if I can move from our Gentile side, he's now going to be the father of the nations in that he's going to be the forefather of all the Jewish people. He's still a man of faith, but he was a man of faith both before and after. And so notice what happens now. He is told that Sarah will become the mother of nations. He is to name the child of promise Isaac. Now here's the irony. Remember we said El? Ishmael, when we're helping God, means God hears. And then the son of promise, they name He laughs. Isn't that ironic? They named the mistake God hears, and they named the child of promise He laughs. We have had friends who have tried to have children and either couldn't and maybe adopted or maybe had a child late in life. And some of our really close friends adopted. And I asked her, they waited for, 30 years trying to have children and stuff. And I said, are you ever bothered when he wakes up at night? And she says, no. We waited so long to have a child, I go in and just listen to him breathe sometime and are just grateful to God that he's here. Can you imagine the laughter in the tent of a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman having a child? And all the things that happen, first steps. The young man starts developing and growing, and on it happens. And all of these things started when Abraham was 100 years old. Our second grandson is named Isaac, and sometimes when he laughs, he has a really hearty laugh. I think, well done, matey, you're a part of your heritage. And so we're going to go from the father of a multitude, and the second patriarch is going to be named He Laughs. And then heel grabber is eventually going to be named Israel, and Israel means he wrestles with God. And we'll look at this next week. And isn't that appropriate? How often for the next 1,500 years do the Israelites wrestle with God, named after the third of the patriarchs? But let's go back to Abraham. For those who are parents and grandparents, this to me is one of the most important verses on child raising in the whole book of Genesis. So we're in number 3. And notice what God tells to Abraham. I have chosen him that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised. And these two words, we'll see later, righteousness and justice, are two of the most important ethical terms through the rest of the Bible, especially for the prophets. And I always ask, where were we introduced to this idea first? And it's with Abraham. I want you to raise Isaac with a spirit of righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised. The idea of righteousness, Brother McCord says, this is where we know Abraham was the first Jew because he bargains God down from 50 to 10. If we can find 50 righteous people, of all things, in Sodom and Gomorrah, and we finally get it down to 10, and how sobering is it to have an entire city in which we can't find 10 righteous people? Just amazing. Again, Abraham asks Sarah to say she's his sister. So he's 100 years old when Isaac is born. Genesis 22 is such an important chapter in that God wants to make sure that Abraham hasn't made an idol out of his son. And as important as children are, our children are never to be more important to us than God is. And there's a whole lesson here we'll come back to. Sarah dies at 123, is buried in the cave of Machpelah. He's going to send his servant back to Haran to find Isaac a wife. And then Abraham dies at 175. Let me just mention one thing on number 6 that we passed. We do not know how old Isaac was when God told him to sacrifice him. However, they're going to go on a long journey, and Isaac is going to carry the wood, so he's not a little bitty kid. I shrug and say 16 to 20. How old would a young man be for you to start strapping wood on him and say, hey, we're going to go hiking and go toward this mountain? And the very fact that Isaac carries the wood for the sacrifice is the only indication we know of how old he is, but he's not a littly, because he wouldn't be physically strong enough to do that. The Hebrew writer, these all died in faith, not having received what was promised, but having seen it, greeted it from afar. They acknowledged they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they came, or Haran, they would have gone out and they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he's prepared for them a city. And I just want to, something I ask myself, is God ashamed to be called my God? And we're going to see the intimacy of this covenant because this special relationship that they have, God says, I'm not ashamed of him. We'll start on Isaac. We'll get rung out here in a second. But notice, Isaac continues to walk in the footprints of his father's faith. He and Ishmael bury their father. He's going to marry Rebekah. Jacob and Esau are going to be born. God renews the promise of children and the covenant to him. I'll bless you and the descendants. All nations will be blessed. Now, I wonder, where did Isaac learn to say, she is my sister? Isaac's favorite son is Esau. Rebekah's is Jacob. And after much deception and lying, Jacob is sent to Laban to seek a wife. So we'll start on these applications, and we may have to come back and finish some of these next week. The first time we find the word righteousness is with Noah. The very imaginations of people's hearts was only evil continually, and God found Noah a righteous man. Then Abraham continues, and as they count the stars, he believed in God. It's reckoned to him as righteousness. And here's what's significant about Abram and Abraham. When you talk with Jewish people, the primary figure in Judaism is Moses. Remember they say about Jesus, we're disciples of Moses, but as this fellow, we don't know who he is and we don't know where he came from. And so for those people who are Jewish, then Moses is the primary figure. But then as you look at Christianity, the paradigm shifts, and Abraham, because of faith, becomes the primary figure of Christianity in terms of Old Testament. Why? He's the father of Gentiles, all these things done by faith before he's circumcised, and then he's also the father of the Jews, and so here's the one person that can help bring all of these different groups of people together in the church because of faith and not because of the law at Mount Sinai. Abraham is the father of all who believe. Paul says he's the father of us all. Those who believe are children of Abraham. If you belong to Christ, you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. And to me, that's very significant spiritually. Every person who's a Christian is a child of Abraham because of faith. Significant. Abraham built altars wherever he went. Isaac is going to come along and do the same things. We've mentioned righteousness and justice already. One of the terms that I love is this sense of walking with God. It's a description of life and lifestyle, and you'll see descriptions of that. But look at number 6. I like the term intergenerational faith. And we're going to see this with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And here's an entire lesson. They also passed down intergenerational faults. And it's amazing how if something isn't repented of and changed over a period of time, we can pass down as many faults as we can faith. And that's very evident in this family. Our oldest daughter has a 5-year-old girl, and we went to a school program recently, and this little boy walks up, and to our daughter he says, "Oh, you're Jillian's mother." And those of us that had children, we have a period of time, we don't have a name, we're just known by our children. And with their feet of clay, I'm always amazed that over and over and again, God is known as the father of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And the God who's holy, sinless, and without fault is known by people with feet of clay, with many faults, but they were also righteous people and people of faith. And that always encourages me that God refers to himself over and over and again by his spiritual children. And we've been blessed by that relationship. Thank you.